If you've ever lost a parent, you know, the world can tilt on its axis in a single moment. The phone call, the hospital room, the finality of it, all grief, is a storm that sweeps through your life, rearranging everything you thought you knew. But what happens when, in the middle of that storm, you discover that the people you trust most are hiding secrets? That's what happened to me. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how my brother changed the locks. After our dad died only to discover I owned the deed to the house he was so desperate to control. It started on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day where the sky feels heavy, pressing down on your shoulders. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee gone cold, when my phone buzzed. It was my brother, Mark. We hadn't spoken much since Dad passed away 2 weeks earlier. Grief had made us strangers, orbiting the same loss, but never quite colliding. "Hey," Mark said, his voice tight. "I need to talk to you about the house." I felt my stomach clench. The house? The old Victorian on Maple Street, the one Dad had poured his life into, the one we'd both grown up in, chasing each other up the creaky stairs, hiding in the attic during thunderstorms. The house was more than bricks and mortar, it was memory. History, the last piece of Dad we had left. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think it's best if I handle things from here," Mark said. "You know, take care of the property, make sure everything's secure. You've got your own place now, and I'm closer. It just makes sense." I could hear the edge in his voice, the way he was trying to sound reasonable. But something felt off. Mark and I had never been close, not really. He was 5 years older, always the golden child, the one Dad relied on for everything. I was the quiet one, the artist, the dreamer. We'd grown up in the same house, but lived in different worlds. "I appreciate that, Mark," I said carefully. "But Dad wanted us both to be involved. He told me so." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing, the faint sound of traffic in the background. "Look, Rachel," he said finally, "I'm just trying to do what's best. I'll call you later." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. Something about the conversation gnawed at me. Mark had always been controlling, but this felt different. It felt final. The next day, I drove to Maple Street. The house looked the same as always, white paint peeling, roses blooming wild along the fence. But when I tried the front door, my key didn't fit. I jiggled it, tried again, nothing. I walked around to the back, tried the kitchen door, same thing. That's when I saw the new locks. Shiny brass, out of place on the old wooden doors. My heart pounded in my chest. Mark had changed the locks, without telling me, without asking. I stood there on the porch, the weight of it settling over me. This was my home, my childhood, and now I was locked out. I called Mark, my hands shaking. He didn't answer. I left a message, then another. No response. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Mark was just being cautious. Maybe he'd lost his key and had to change the locks. But deep down, I knew better. This was deliberate. This was about control. I started digging through my files, looking for anything that might help. That's when I found the deed to the house. I remembered Dad giving it to me a year before he died, after his first heart attack. "Just in case," he'd said, pressing the envelope into my hands. "I want you to have this. You're good with details." Mark's got enough on his plate. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Dad was always planning ahead, always making sure things were in order. But now, as I unfolded the crisp legal document, I realized what it meant. The house was in my name, not Mark's. Not both of ours. Mine. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. Why hadn't Dad told Mark? Why hadn't he told me more? Had he known this would happen? I called a lawyer, just to be sure. She confirmed if the deed was valid. The house was legally mine. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief, because I wasn't powerless. Guilt, because Mark didn't know. Because I hadn't known. Because Dad had kept this secret, maybe to protect me, maybe to protect Mark. I tried calling Mark again. This time, he picked up. "What do you want, Rachel?" he snapped. "I want to talk about the house," I said, my voice trembling. "I found the deed. Dad put it in my name." There was a long silence. I could hear his breath, sharp and uneven. "That's not possible," he said finally. "Dad would never do that." "He did," I said quietly. "I have the papers. I talked to a lawyer." Mark's anger exploded. "You think you can just waltz in and take everything? After all, I've given up." I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He hung up. And this time, I knew he wouldn't call back. I sat on my couch, the deed in my lap, and cried. Not just for the house or for Mark, but for everything we'd lost. For the family we used to be, for the secrets that had grown between us, silent and poisonous. But I knew I couldn't let Mark bully me out of what was rightfully mine. I had to stand up for myself, for Dad's wishes, for the home that meant so much to us both. That was just the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and determination. I kept replaying the conversation with Mark in my head, his voice echoing with disbelief and anger. I wondered if he was sitting in the old living room, surrounded by Dad's books and the faded photographs on the mantel, stewing in resentment. Or maybe he was plotting his next move, convinced that I was the villain in his story. I didn't want a war. I wanted understanding. I wanted my brother back, or at least the version of him I remembered from childhood, the one who used to push me on the tire swing in the backyard, who taught me how to ride a bike, who snuck me cookies when Dad wasn't looking. But grief changes people. It sharpens old wounds, turns love into suspicion. I decided to go back to the house, this time with the deed in my bag and a resolve I didn't know I had. I parked across the street, watching the windows for any sign of Mark. The house looked empty, but I couldn't be sure. I walked up the path, my heart pounding, and rang the doorbell. No answer. I tried calling Mark again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice calm but firm. "Mark, I have the deed. I'm coming by to talk. We need to figure this out together." I waited on the porch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. I thought about all the times I'd sat here as a kid, waiting for Dad to come home from work, for Mark to finish his baseball practice. The porch had always felt safe, a place of anticipation and comfort. Now it felt like a border, a line I wasn't sure I was allowed to cross. After an hour, I gave up and drove home, but I wasn't ready to let it go. I called the lawyer again, asking what my options were. She explained that, as the legal owner, I had every right to access the property. If Mark refused to let me in, I could call the police or change the locks myself. The thought made me uneasy. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also couldn't let Mark shut me out. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Dad, about the choices he'd made. Why had he put the house in my name? Was it because he trusted me more? Or was he trying to protect me from Mark's controlling tendencies? I wished I could ask him, wished I could hear his voice one more time. The next morning, I decided to take action. I called a locksmith and explained the situation. He agreed to meet me at the house that afternoon. As I drove over, I rehearsed what I would say to Mark if he showed up. I wanted to be calm, reasonable, but I was ready to stand my ground. The locksmith arrived right on time, a friendly man with kind eyes. I showed him the deed, explained that my brother had changed the locks without my permission. He nodded, understanding immediately. "Family stuff can get messy," he said, pulling out his tools. "You'd be surprised how often I see this." As he worked, I stood on the porch, my nerves jangling. I half expected Mark to come barreling down the street, demanding to know what I was doing. But the neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a lawnmower. Within minutes, the locksmith had the door open. He handed me a new set of keys, his expression sympathetic. "Good luck," he said, and drove away. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old wood and lavender washing over me. The house was just as I remembered: Dad's armchair by the window, the faded rug in the hallway, the kitchen table cluttered with mail and half-finished crossword puzzles. But it felt different, too. Emptier. Like the soul of the place had gone with Dad. I walked through each room, memories flooding back. The living room, where we'd decorated Christmas trees. The dining room, where we'd celebrated birthdays. The staircase where I'd sat and listened to Mark and Dad argue about college, about money, about everything and nothing. In Dad's study, I found a stack of letters addressed to both Mark and me. I sat down at the desk, my hands trembling as I opened the first envelope. Dad's handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "My dearest Rachel and Mark," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I want you to know how much I love you both, and how proud I am of the people you've become. I know things haven't always been easy between you, but I hope you'll find a way to come together now. For each other and for this house." I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face. Dad had wanted us to share the house, to find common ground, but he'd put the deed in my name. Maybe he'd hoped I would be the peacemaker, the one to bring us back together. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning, sorting through Dad's things, trying to make sense of the chaos. I found old photographs, birthday cards, a box of marks, baseball trophies. Each item was a piece of our family's history, a reminder of what we'd lost. As the sun set, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart leaped into my throat. I walked to the front door, bracing myself. Mark stood on the porch, his face flushed with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I have every right to be here," I said, holding up the deed. "This is my house, Mark." Dad left it to me. He stared at the paper, his jaw clenched. "You think a piece of paper changes everything? You think you can just erase me?" "I'm not trying to erase you," I said, my voice breaking. "I want us to figure this out together." "For Dad?" Mark shook his head, his eyes cold. "You've made your choice." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, the weight of the house pressing down on me. The days after Mark's confrontation felt like living in a house with invisible walls. I moved through the rooms, cleaning, sorting, and remembering. But every step was shadowed by the knowledge that my brother was out there, angry and hurt. I wanted to call him, to explain again, but every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. What could I say that I hadn't already said? How could I bridge a gap that seemed to grow wider with every passing day? I tried to focus on practical matters. There were bills to pay, insurance forms to fill out, and a mountain of paperwork that Dad had left behind. I found myself learning about property taxes, home maintenance, and all the little details that come with owning a house. It was overwhelming, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time since Dad died, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. But the house was lonely. At night, I would sit in the living room, listening to the creaks and groans of the old wood, the wind rattling the windows. Sometimes I would hear footsteps on the porch and my heart would leap, hoping it was Mark coming to talk. But it was always just the wind or a stray cat or nothing at all. One evening, as I was sorting through a box of Dad's old records, I heard a noise outside. I froze, listening. There it was again, a soft thud, like someone trying to be quiet. I crept to the window and peered out. In the dim light, I saw Mark standing by the garage, his shoulders hunched, his hands in his pockets. I hesitated, then opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cool and smelled of rain. "Mark," I called softly. He turned, startled. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence stretching between us. "I just came to get some of my stuff," he said finally, his voice flat. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my tone gentle. "You don't have to sneak around, this is still your home too." He didn't answer, just walked past me into the garage. I followed, watching as he rummaged through boxes, pulling out old tools and a battered baseball glove. "Dad wanted us to share this place," I said quietly. "He wrote us a letter." "Did you see it?" Mark shook his head, not looking at me. "I don't need a letter to know what Dad wanted. He wanted us to be a family. But you went behind my back." I felt a surge of frustration. "I didn't go behind your back, Mark. Dad gave me the deed. I didn't even know until after he died. I'm just trying to do what's right." He slammed a box shut, his face twisted with anger. "You always were the favorite. Dad never trusted me, not really. He always thought you were the responsible one." "That's not true," I said, my voice trembling. "He loved us both. He wanted to make sure the house was taken care of." Mark laughed bitterly. "Yeah, well, congratulations. You got what you wanted." He grabbed his things and stormed out, leaving me standing in the garage, the smell of dust and old memories thick in the air. I went back inside, my heart heavy. I knew Mark was hurting, but I didn't know how to reach him. I thought about calling our aunt, the only family we had left, but I wasn't sure what I would say. I felt alone, caught between loyalty to my brother and the responsibility Dad had given me. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the front door. It was from Mark. Rachel, I'm sorry for how I acted. I don't know how to deal with all this. I miss Dad. I miss how things used to be. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I'll try. Mark. I read the note over and over, tears blurring the words. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. I decided to write back. I poured my heart onto the page, telling Mark how much I missed Dad, how much I missed him. I told him I didn't want the house to come between us, that I was willing to find a way to share it, to make it work for both of us. I left the letter on the porch, hoping he would find it. Days passed. I kept busy fixing leaky faucets, painting the front door, trying to breathe new life into the old house. Each task was a small act of healing, a way to honor Dad's memory. One afternoon, as I was weeding the garden, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mark standing there, holding my letter. I read your note, he said quietly. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands. I meant every word. He looked at the house, then back at me. I don't know if I can ever feel the same about this place, but maybe we can try. For Dad, I nodded, relief flooding through me. I'd like that. We stood there in the garden, the sun warm on our faces, the house looming behind us. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. That night, we sat on the porch together, talking about Dad, about the past, about the future. We laughed, we cried, we remembered. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope, but I knew there were still challenges ahead. Grief doesn't disappear overnight, and neither do old wounds. But as I looked at my brother, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The next few weeks were a slow, awkward dance of reconciliation. Mark and I circled each other carefully, like two people learning to trust again after a long betrayal. We started small, sharing coffee on the porch in the mornings, working together to clear out the attic, sorting through boxes of old clothes and forgotten toys. Each task was a reminder of the life we'd shared, the childhood we'd both lost and, in some ways, were still searching for. Sometimes, the work brought laughter. We found a box of Dad's old ties, each one more garish than the last, and tried them on, posing in front of the hallway mirror. We discovered a stack of letters Mark had written to Santa Claus, complete with elaborate crayon drawings of the toys he wanted. We even unearthed a faded Polaroid of the two of us, grinning with missing teeth, standing in front of the house on the first day of school. But there were hard moments, too. Sometimes, Mark would snap at me over something small or misplaced tool. A forgotten appointment hand. I'd feel the old tension flare up between us. Other times, I'd catch him staring at the deed, his jaw tight, and I'd wonder if he resented me for having the final say. The house was a living reminder of everything we'd lost, and everything we still had to figure out. One afternoon, as we were cleaning out the basement, Mark found a box labeled legal. Inside were folders of old documents, insurance policies, and a letter from Dad's lawyer. Mark handed it to me, his expression unreadable. You should probably look at this, he said. I opened the letter, my hands trembling. It was dated a year before Dad died, and it explained his decision to put the house in my name. He wrote about his fears for the future, about wanting to make sure the house stayed in the family, about trusting me to handle things if anything happened to him. He also wrote about Mark, about his pride in him, but also his worries. Dad had seen the way Mark struggled with responsibility, the way he sometimes let anger get the best of him. Reading Dad's words, I felt a wave of sadness and understanding. He hadn't meant to hurt Mark. He'd just been trying to protect us both, in the only way he knew how. I handed the letter to Mark, watching his face as he read. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, "Did you know about any of this?" I shook my head. Not until after he died. I wish he'd told us both. Mark nodded, folding the letter carefully. I guess he did what he thought was best. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of Dad's choices settling between us. It wasn't fair, but it was real, and it was up to us to decide what to do next. That evening, we sat down at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a stack of notes. We started making lists what needed fixing, what we wanted to keep, what we could let go. We talked about the future of the house. Should we sell it? Rent it out? Keep it in the family for the next generation? For the first time, the conversation felt like a partnership. Mark had ideas I hadn't considered about turning the basement into a rental unit, about starting a small garden in the backyard, about hosting family gatherings to keep the memories alive. I realized that, for all our differences, we both wanted the same thing: to honor Dad's legacy and to find a way forward together. But the process wasn't easy. There were disagreements about money, about priorities, about what Dad would have wanted. Sometimes the old resentments bubbled up, threatening to undo the progress we'd made. But each time, we found a way to talk it through, to listen, to compromise. One night, after a particularly heated argument about whether to repaint the living room, Mark surprised me. He apologized, not just for the fight, but for everything: for changing the locks, for shutting me out, for letting his anger get in the way. I was scared, he admitted, his voice raw. I thought I was losing everything, Dad. The house, you. I didn't know how to handle it. I reached across the table and took his hand. Me too, I said, but we're still here. We still have each other. It wasn't a magic fix. There were still days when the grief felt overwhelming, when the house felt too big and too empty. But there were also days when it felt like home again, a place of comfort, of possibility, of hope. We started inviting friends and family over, filling the rooms with laughter and conversation. We hosted a small memorial for Dad, sharing stories and memories, celebrating the life he'd built for us. It was bittersweet, but it felt right. Through it all, I kept the deed in a safe place. But I stopped thinking of it as a weapon or a shield. It was just a piece of paper, symbol of responsibility, yes, but also of trust. I realized that Dad hadn't chosen me because he loved me more, or because he trusted Mark less. He'd chosen me because he believed I could bring us together, even when it seemed impossible. And slowly, that's what we did. As the months passed, the house on Maple Street began to change, not just in the ways you could see, but in the ways you could feel. The air felt lighter, the rooms warmer. Mark and I found a rhythm, a new kind of partnership that neither of us had expected. We learned to rely on each other, to ask for help, to admit when we were struggling. The house became a project, a shared mission, and in working together, we started to heal. We tackled the big things first. The roof needed repairs, the plumbing was ancient, and the backyard was a jungle of weeds and overgrown roses. We hired contractors for the jobs we couldn't handle, but we did as much as we could ourselves. There was something satisfying about working side by side, sweating and laughing and sometimes arguing, but always moving forward. One Saturday, as we were painting the living room, Mark put down his roller and looked at me. "You know, I never thought we'd get here," he said. "I thought the house would tear us apart." I smiled, wiping a streak of blue paint from my cheek. "Me too. But maybe it's what brought us back together." He nodded, thoughtful. I guess Dad knew what he was doing, after all. We both laughed, the sound echoing off the freshly painted walls. It felt good, like a release, like forgiveness. We started making new memories in the house. We hosted Sunday dinners, inviting friends and neighbors. We celebrated birthdays and holidays, filling the rooms with music and laughter. We even started a tradition of movie nights in the living room, complete with popcorn and old family favorites. The house, once a battleground, became a sanctuary. But it wasn't just about the house. It was about Usab, like learning to see each other as adults, as equals, as family. We talked about everything: our childhood, our dreams, our fears. We shared stories about Dad, remembering the good times and the hard times. We grieved together, and in doing so, we found a way to move forward. There were still challenges. Grief is a long road, and some days were harder than others. There were moments when the loss felt fresh, when the house felt too quiet, too empty. But we faced those moments together, supporting each other in ways we never had before. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Mark turned to me. "Do you ever think about selling?" he asked quietly. I considered the question. There had been times, in the early days, when I'd wanted nothing more than to walk, a wait to leave the pain and the memories behind. But now, the thought of selling felt different. The house wasn't just a burden anymore. It was a part of us. Sometimes, I admitted. But I think Dad wanted us to keep it in the family, at least for a while. Mark nodded. Yeah, I think you're right. We sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after a long journey together. I realized that, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. Whatever happened, we would face it together. A few weeks later, we got a letter from a distant cousin, someone we barely remembered. She'd heard about Dad's passing and wanted to reconnect. She wrote about her own memories of the house, about family gatherings and summer barbecue. She asked if she could visit to see the place one more time. We invited her over, and the visit turned into an impromptu family reunion. Cousins, aunts, and uncles filled the house, sharing stories and laughter. The rooms were alive with energy, with love. It was exactly what Dad would have wanted. After everyone left, Mark and I stood in the kitchen, exhausted but happy. Do you think we'll ever really be done with this place? He asked, looking around at the mess of dishes and empty glasses. I shook my head, smiling. I hope not. I think that's the point. The house isn't just ours, it's everyone's. It's family. He grinned, and for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the brother I'd missed for so long. As the seasons changed, so did we. The house became a place of growth, of possibility. We planted a garden in the backyard, filling it with vegetables and flowers. We adopted a stray cat that had been hanging around, naming her Maple after the street. We even started hosting community events, opening the house to neighbors and friends. Through it all, the deed stayed tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of the journey we'd taken. It was no longer a source of conflict, but a symbol of trust and responsibility. I knew that, if the time ever came to pass the house on, we would do it together as a family. Looking back, I realized that the house had given us more than just a place to live. It had given us a chance to heal, to forgive, to start over. It had taught us about love, about loss, about the importance of holding a hand, of letting go. I thought about Dad, about the choices he'd made, about the legacy he'd left behind. I hoped he would be proud of us, of the way we'd come together, of the family we were building. As I stood on the porch one evening, watching the lights flicker on in the windows, I felt a sense of peace. The house was still old, still creaky, still full of memories, but it was also full of life, of hope, of new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the first anniversary of Dad's passing approached, Mark and I found ourselves reflecting on everything that had changed. The house, once a symbol of conflict and loss, had become a place of comfort and connection. We'd learned to navigate the complexities of grief, of family, of forgiveness. And in doing so, we'd discovered a strength we never knew we had. On the morning of the anniversary, I woke early and wandered through the quiet house. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patterns on the worn wooden floors. I paused in each room, remembering the moments that had shaped the arguments, the laughter, the tears. Every corner held a story, a piece of our shared history. I found Mark in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up and smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that spoke of everything we'd been through. "Ready for today?" he asked. I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. We'd planned a small gathering for family and close, friends, a way to honor Dad's memory, to celebrate the life he'd lived and the legacy he'd left behind. We spent the morning preparing, setting out photos and mementos, arranging flowers from the garden. The house filled with the scent of fresh coffee and baking bread, the sounds of quiet conversation and shared memories. As people arrived, the rooms came alive with warmth and love. Stories flowed isolitos of Dad's stubbornness, his kindness, his terrible jokes. We laughed, we cried, we remembered. And through it all, I felt Dad's presence not as a shadow, but as a gentle light guiding us forward. At one point, Mark stood up and cleared his throat. The room fell silent as he spoke. "I know this year hasn't been easy," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Losing Dad was hard, but in a strange way, it brought us back together. This house, it's more than just a building. It's where we learned to be a family, even when it was hard. I want to thank Rachel for everything she's done for keeping us together, for honoring Dad's wishes, for reminding me what really matters. He looked at me, his eyes shining with gratitude and something deep, forgiveness, acceptance. I stood and hugged him, feeling the weight of the past year lift from my shoulders. In that moment, I knew we'd made it through the storm. We'd found our way home. As the sun set and the last guests said their goodbyes, Mark and I sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. The house behind us glowed with the warmth of family, of memories, of hope. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" I asked quietly. Mark nodded. "I know he would." We sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing you've faced the worst and come out stronger. The house creaked and settled around us, as if it, too, was breathing a sigh of relief. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. There were still challenges, still moments of sadness and longing, but there was also joy and laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing we'd honored Dad's legacy in the best way we could by choosing each other, by choosing family. The locks on the doors were new, but the sense of home was old and deep. The deed was still in my name, but the house belonged to both of us in every way that mattered. We'd learned that ownership wasn't about paperwork or legal rights. That was about love, about responsibility, about the willingness to fight for what mattered most. As I looked out at the garden, at the house that had shaped our lives, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for Dad, for Mark, for the chance to start over, for the home we'd rebuilt together. And I knew whatever the future held, we would face it side by side, stronger, wiser, and forever bound by the love that had carried us through.